Warning. This episode is going full speed ahead into spoiler territory for the Magnus archives. I'm talking about spoiling basically everything in the show here, so if you have any intention of listening to it, which you should if you haven't already, bookmark this page and book it out of here so you can enjoy the series in its true glory. Also, this episode is going to feature in-depth discussions of fear, in particular as they relate to the dark, lacking information, the cold, and monsters lurking in the shadows. As a result, viewer discretion is advised. Oh, and a massive thank you to the Magnus Archives wiki, which was very useful in getting the info for this video together. Hey y'all, I'm Afton Geek here, and welcome back to the only channel where the G stands for gloom. As we're in a new month, it would appear that I have a new Entities Explained video to make, so here we go. In the Magnus Archives, there are 15 things that were fear, which exist on the periphery of reality, occasionally bleeding out in the form of avatars, books, monsters, and more. I've been analyzing each in turn, with this being the 9th entry in a series you can watch the rest of now, just by clicking the iCard on screen. By the way, if you enjoy content like this, consider subscribing. It helps the channel out a lot, and helps push us ever closer to that 1K goal. Now, it's time to sink deep into the brackish waters of one of the oldest fears known to man, because we're finally talking about the dark. The dark, also known as the Forever Blind, or one of my personal favorite alternate names, Mr. Pitch, is, as you may expect, the fear of the dark. Cold, simple, and ancient, the dark was likely one of the first entities, being birthed from the fears of early humans and other diurnal prey animals who have been plunged into abyssal blackness. However, the dark also encompasses the fear of things which may hide in the shadows, figures just out of view, either by crouching in wait where no light can pierce, or by making it themselves. Agents of the dark often move and act in the shadows, leaving their victims confused, disoriented, and often in several pieces by the time the lights come back on. The dark also seems to be connected to opaque water, especially when that water seems to refuse to let go, and the sensation of coldness. Then, of course, there's the common trend of blindness appearing, which makes sense for an entity so completely tied to an inability to see, and its role as a blind spot of knowledge. Pun absolutely intended. The dark is a weird one as far as characters go. More specifically, while almost every entity has a sliding scale of humanity in its manifestations, the dark is one of the only ones which has a lot of very humanoid followers, and a lot of very inhuman monsters, and almost no in-between. As a result, I'm actually splitting this section in two, with this half covering the human-ish characters, and the other covering the much more out-there devotees of the dark. If we're going to be talking about the characters, there's no better place to start than the organization that so many of them belong to, the People's Church of the Divine Host. Regardless of if you think the Cult of the Lightless Flame would have worked better as their name, the People's Church is a religious organization which seems to follow the dark. Using the symbol of a shut eye, their reach seems to stretch very far, even reaching as far as the outermost points of civilization, thanks to shell companies like Outer Bay Shipping. They appear to have sprung from a group known as Those Who Sing the Night, who destroyed an ancient iteration of the archives, but have really come into the modern group we recognize with the help of a great leader known to some as Maxwell Rayner. I say to some because Rayner has gone through a few changes over the years. His original body and name were those of Edmund Halley, because if TMA is good at one thing, it's making semi-obscure historical figures sound way more interesting. Anyways, Halley decided to freak John Flamsteed, his rival, out by drowning in a dark pool, but his work ethic is impeccable, because he still found a way to show up to his job only a few days later. It's from Flamsteed that we likely get Rayner's modern name, being a corruption of the mocking nickname Raymers, which we first see appearing in 1864. The name Rayner seems to be used by quite a few people who led followers of the dark from that point forward, all of whom were likely blind in appearance, including one who may have planted the idea of the entities in Smirk's brain, so you can blame him for this entire series. Rayner did a lot, actually, from helping fund the Daedalus to destroying a family, which he managed to accomplish by transferring his soul every once in a while to another host in the form of a dark mist, Unfortunately for him, this wound up being his undoing, with Raynor being fatally shot by the police while trying to transfer into the body of a young boy. Speaking of that young boy, while not technically a member of the church, he was going to be the vessel for Raynor and did wind up becoming the avatar of Night Street, so I think Callum Brody is worth mentioning here. Moving on, there's Manuela Dominguez, who, I'll admit right now, is one of my favorite statement givers of the entire series. She was one of the head honchos of the People's Church, and still found the time to be a very skilled scientist. Manuela got the opportunity to combine those interests when the Daedalus was launched, using a nyctophobe in a box as a battery while in orbit to create the Dark Sun. A very powerful artifact for Mr. Pitch. The church did wind up using it in their Extinguished Sun ritual, which we'll get into later, but things went awry, and Manuela was left alone in Ny-Alesund, guarding the Dark Sun for the day that the church may reawaken. Because nothing seems to work out for her, though, John showed up to destroy the Dark Sun, which he did, and Manuela was left to roam the Distortion's corridors until it finally digests her, which it also presumably did. Natalie Ennis seems to be a newer recruit, but she also had quite a bit of influence on joining, so maybe the Forever Blind just particularly liked her. One notable member was Lynette Montauk, who was silenced by the group after trying to leave, and then avenged by her husband, Robert Montauk, who killed a member named Christopher Lorne, and presumably, from all of the hearts, at least a few others. If this is sounding familiar, you probably recognize this family from my Hunt Explained video, where Julia Montauk played a significant role, most notably for our current purposes killing off Varden Darvish, who ran another presumed shell in Manchester called DKN Systems. There is arguably one more member, but they won't be appearing until the next section, so that covers all of the inarguably human-ish characters. Starting into the Dark's monsters, I'm going to be moving from most humanoid to least, alright? Let's get to it. The Sandman is a creature based on E.T.A. Hoffman's Der Sandmann, being a strange beast indeed which eternally pours sand from its mouth. When it finds a victim, it carries them away in its sack, plunging them into total darkness within which they are presented with a choice: be whisked away by the Sandman, or use the sand to blind yourself. Also, Raynor can apparently just sick it on anyone he likes, which is just another point for his inclusion in the Scary Evil Old Men Club. If you're lucky enough to bring a camera along on your next urban exploration, you may just catch a glimpse of this next creature. The shadow figures are seemingly incorporeal humanoids, found only in photographs but able to interact with the physical world through its shadows. When applied to human beings, it can, as you might expect, have some horrifying results. Judging by the fact that the rector of St. Paul's Church in which they were discovered seems to be hiding their existence, it also could indicate ties to the People's Church, or a similar organization. One creature which is undeniably tied to the People's Church, though, is the Still and Lightless Beast. Another horror under Raynor's control, this immaterial monster killed Lynette Montauk and later Robert, but not before he managed to banish or seal it away for some stretch of time. Eventually the creature was killed and its claws played an essential role in the Dark's latest ritual attempt. The final monster we need to talk about is, I would probably wager to guess, one of the scariest things that the mind of Johnny Sims has ever concocted. Yeah, y'all already know what it is, but I have to cover it because this is what I do. Appearing to be passed on from victim to victim, the creature is a formless figure covered in feelers and seeming to be made up mostly of dark liquid. It appears in the darkness and slowly inches towards its victim, only stopping when they pull their blanket over their head. Of course, once the victim begins to adjust to the new routine of avoiding the creature and becomes comfortable with its visits, it finally reveals the truth. The blanket never did anything. Seriously, this episode is terrifying. If you haven't listened to it, go do so now. If you have, also go do so now. Do it. I'll be right here when you get back, unless old Tentacles in the corner gets me first. Fortunately for us, the Dark doesn't actually have that many artifacts, so this section should be pretty quick. In the same supplemental as the stone eye and the scalpel, John mentions a wardrobe into which no light can enter. While it's not explicitly stated to belong to the dark, I'd say that's a pretty solid ID. I suppose you could argue that the hearts of the church members had some amount of magical properties, being used to drive away the still and lightless beast, but y'all know I'm just looking for things to say before mentioning the big one, the Dark Star. Also called the Black Sun, the Dark Star is a very powerful artifact of the Forever Blind, apparently radiating darkness instead of light, which makes very little sense, but given that the whole TMA world operates on nightmare logic, let's just roll with it. It was created on board the Daedalus by Manuela Dominguez, and an unwilling helper trapped below the ship as a centerpiece for the Dark's ritual. Only those with the strongest ties to the Dark were ever able to gaze upon it, with the notable exception of Jonathan Sims, who uses his eye magic to not only survive the ordeal, but destroy the Dark Star in the process, surviving the downfall of a world-ending ritual, only to be taken down by an angry, short, and very tired wet cat of a man has got to really sting, though. Because the dark tends to pop up in a lot of places, it can be hard to figure out what location should be attributed to it, but I'll try my best. The most obvious one is Ny-Ålesund, the farthest north permanent human civilization, and also a center point for the Dark's 2015 ritual. It was also where the Dark Star was kept until John destroyed it. Shared between the dark, lonely, and vast, we have the Daedalus space station, which, as mentioned above, was key in Manuela Dominguez's creation of the Dark Star. The other locations worth mentioning are a little more nebulous, being the different lost and forgotten places of worship the People's Church used. The Hithergreen Chapel is probably the most notable, but we also know of ones that were located in Alaska and Russia, not to mention the office building that Darvish and the rest of DKN Systems were working out of. I know an office building isn't generally what you'd consider to be a place of worship, but honestly, what else would you call the room Julia found? Besides creepy. The Extinguished Sun is the confirmed dark ritual we know of, taking place in 2015, although we could presume that another dark ritual occurred 300 years prior during the last eclipse over Ny-Ålesund. Interestingly, because Smirk was inspired by his interaction with Raynor to concoct his rituals, it's possible that this one follows what was written by Smirk more closely, although the modern one is likely quite far, given the use of technologies Smirk could never have imagined in the creation of the Dark Star. Going back to the more recent ritual, it is actually one of the rituals we know the most about, thanks to Manuela's statement on the matter and role in its creation. The Extinguished Sun started with a week of night and horror, which was kicked off by the slaying of the still and lightless beast. The cultists drank its blood, baptized themselves in the water it had blessed, and Raynor used its claws to tear into his chest, releasing his inner darkness, whatever that means. Oh, and there was singing. From there, sacrifices were plunged into pure gloom, and the whole of the church tried to sing Mr. Pitch into being. Unfortunately for them, the ritual failed, seemingly with no external influence, which also served to strengthen both Gertrude and Elias's beliefs that the rituals were inherently flawed. Oh, and for all I've talked about it, I forgot to mention the Dark Star. It's not totally clear what the Dark Star did for the ritual, but we know it did something, and that's all that matters. Weirdly, the dark doesn't actually appear in many domains. Before we get to the big one, I feel like I should mention the ocean, which, while probably more fitting of the vast given its themes of inescapable, well, vastness, does definitely have some crossover with the dark. Alright, now let's talk about Night Street, also known as Jonah Magnus's daycare for troubled youths. Run by Callum Brody, who apparently managed to become an avatar of the dark in full after his encounter with Raynor, Night Street is built on the childish fears of monsters in the dark, allowing the Eye, and the other powers for that matter, to grow children into proper adult fear batteries with complex terrors. In the meanwhile, though, the children are continuously pursued by an ever more dangerous world, all while Brody would occasionally appear to create some new, horrible monster in their minds. Not a lot of fiction material manages to properly capture what being a kid who was afraid of everything feels like, but Johnny managed to get damn close with this one. Bravo. Alright, time to talk about connections. First off, it's pretty clear that the dark lonely, and vast all at least tolerate each other, or their leaders wouldn't have been willing to give so much money to a joint venture. The dark and the lonely seem to have minor religious elements, given the traditions of the Lucases and the overtly devout People's Church, while the vast and the dark see strong overlap in the crushing knowledge of nature, whether by being a creature of light thrust into a natural world of darkness, or by simply presenting the great totality of all of reality. Also, all three of them share strong thematic similarities, as it's easy to feel alone in a large, dark space. Isolation, insignificance, and sensory deprivation are all really just sides of the same coin. The stranger also seems to share some similarities with the dark, as both are used to symbolize the absence of knowledge, though part of that might be because of the fact that we see through the eyes, pun intended, of the Institute. Speaking of them, we have the eye's relationship with the dark, which is completely on the other side. It might be easier to mention the ways that the eye and the dark haven't tried to tear each other down, but in brief, Jonah and Raynor went from friends to enemies because of their respective fear gods, eventually leading Jonah, acting as Elias, to reveal Raynor's location to the cops and inadvertently get him killed. Manuela and Raynor both also made it very clear that they hate the Institute and what it represents, offering Elias and Gertrude protection in the blind world they sought to create if they abandoned their patron. The People's Church actually thought that the Institute had something to do with the failure of their ritual, and wound up keeping an eye on them for quite a while. If we go further back in history, we'll see that an iteration of the Institute was brought to collapse by followers of the Dark, which generally doesn't show good faith. Oh, and I haven't even mentioned the fact that the symbol of the People's Church is a closed eye. Can't get much more obvious than that. That leaves us with the fun part, the analysis. Let's start off by talking about my ongoing theme in all of these videos, which is how the entity is going to fit into my increasingly stretched narrative themes allegory. Well, the dark could symbolize a few things, but I think the best connection is in its role as mystery. Well, as Michael once said, the stranger conceals and the spiral lies, the dark simply removes. The stranger is nonsensical, but it still gives you information. The dark, meanwhile, acts specifically by decreasing the amount of information available to those who try and understand it. The fear of the dark is at its core the fear of the unknown. The reason I went off on this semi-side tangent is both because it's a really interesting lens to view the dark through, and because it helps us understand why I say mystery is what's at the dark's core. Every story has to it some degree of mystery. For some, it's very overt, like a classic whodunit, but for others, it's less clear. Still, even in stories where we know the outcome from the beginning, there exists mystery. From the opening lines of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, we know that the two main characters are destined to die, but the mystery is in how they get there. Mystery exists purely because there's a knowledge imbalance between the narrative and the audience that, when you think about it, is inherent to life. You probably didn't know you were going to click on this video however many minutes ago, yet here you are. This could also be expanded into including dramatic irony, but that feels a little too niche to talk about on its own, and now I'm getting lost in the weeds. Anyways, yes, mysteries rely on the absence of knowledge, and you know what else relies on the absence of knowledge? The fear of the dark. Point made. The other thing I want to mention here is the dark's ties to religion, and you know what? I made a joke about it earlier, but here's a little side rant about why the names of the cults in TMA should have been switched. If you think about it, the followers of the Desolation are seeking to create a vessel through which their god can interact with the physical world, or in other words, a divine host, while the followers of the Dark went to space to create a dark star, a ball of flaming gas which emits dark instead of light, or in other words, a lightless flame. Seriously, how did this happen? Anyways, mini rant over. Back to the never controversial topic of religion. The Dark and Manuela Dominguez in particular create a really fascinating look at the relationship between science and faith. Something you might not have noticed on a first listen is that the Dark seems to be associated with science a lot. Manuela is some kind of brilliant scientist with a knowledge of dark matter. Darvish's shell company is operating primarily in technology, and hell, Raynor was originally famed English astronomer and physicist Edmund Halley. Natalie Ennis was a devout Christian before the passing of her mother, at which point she turned that devotion towards Mr. Pitch. In Mag 135, Manuela talks at length about the faith of her parents, and how misguided they were for believing in a god of light when, according to her, the universe's natural state is shrouded in murk. But what's interesting is that she uses similar wording to describe her newfound beliefs. Hell, Manuela's Mag 143 statement ends with the phrase, "finished the last remnants of our holy crusade," which is quite a loaded sentence on its own. This is a big part of why I find Manuela to be such an interesting character. She's a very special type of hypocrite, but one who acknowledges it. She makes it clear that what she did on the Daedalus was nothing even close to science, and that she now has as much faith in Raynor as her parents once had in another source. To have a character who is a scientist that looks down on faith while also engaging in a ritual where they drink the blood of a slain beast to break an eldritch god into our plane of existence is fascinating and something I don't think people bring up enough. Anyways, yeah, the People's Church is really interesting, and I wish we as a community talked about them more. Alright, that brings us to the end of this episode of Entities Explained, and with it, our coverage of the dark. As always, be sure to let me know if I missed anything, if you have any theories, if you disagree with anything I said, or if you just want to say hi. You can do all of that and more in the comments down below. I read through all of them, and I'll be sure to credit people who bring up things I missed whenever I do the wrap-up video at the end. Be sure to subscribe if you're new, since so many of y'all want to ride this series out to completion, and prepare your muscle tissues, cause next time we'll be talking about viscera. Anyways, I've been Afton Geek here, and this has been Entities Explained. Good night, YouTube people.